Welcome to this week's Empowered Living. I'm your host, Kenny Collier. Last week we started looking in our series about science confirming the Bible. We started looking at the problems and the many holes in evolution. We started with stellar evolution and chemical evolution and debunking some of those theories because they're anti-God. And so if God, who is the creator of all things, according to his word, we see it in Genesis, the creation account very clearly, and his words would be true, then what comes out against him that is supposed to operate without him, it simply can't be true. So this week I want to start looking at biological evolution. The word says in Genesis chapter 1 that on day 5, the birds of the air and the fishes, the whales, and the ocean, the sea brought forth abundantly. And then in day 6 came the land animals and the creeping things on the land, and man was created, and then woman from that man. And so looking at that, how could it be when evolution says it comes from bacteria creating a human, it just takes millions of billions of years? So obviously these are at odds. So let's take a look at this. For example, a lot of people attribute the mechanisms to allow evolution from molecules to man, from non-living chemical compounds into a living organism, a human being, to the ideas of Darwin. Even though he made great to popularize the idea, it did exist before that. But his type of evolution, Darwinian evolution, the supposed mechanism to make it happen is twofold or threefold, and that is natural selection and beneficial mutations and speciation. So I want to take a look at that today real quick to show you the holes in how these things, natural selection and mutations, do not create new information. It is only ever reducing information and dealing with information that has already existed. Okay? So understand this. Death entered the world as the result of sin. Death, therefore, is in the world. It's a punishment for man's disobedience to God. And it should remind us that the world that we live in is sin-cursed and needs a Savior. Death is not a good thing. It's actually called an enemy to God, and the last enemy to come underneath the victorious return of Jesus Christ. Natural selection, however, is fueled by death. And it helps the population by getting rid of genetic defects. In the same way that without the death of Jesus, okay, he wouldn't have conquered death itself and then been glorified in his resurrection. So here's what natural selection can do through death. Now, natural selection is simply choosing certain traits that are more beneficial in a certain environment. Okay? For example, if you had beetles that could fly on an island and it was windy with the ocean breeze constantly, they may get blown out to sea and die and drown because they can't get back to land. And then you have the same species of beetles, but yet they couldn't form wings, so therefore they were grounded to the ground, and therefore they were selected to live because they weren't blown out to sea to die. However, there's issues with that because those beetles now are more susceptible to predators. So let's take a look at this. Here's what natural selection can do. Natural selection can decrease genetic information in your DNA, in your cells. Natural selection cannot increase or provide new genes, new proteins, new genetic information, and new DNA. Natural selection can allow organisms to survive better in a certain environment. Okay, but natural selection cannot allow organisms to evolve from one kind of species to another kind. In other words, it will not allow a dog to evolve into a cat or vice versa. You get my drift. Natural selection can act as a selector, however, so it can choose certain traits. But natural selection cannot be an originator of traits. The traits already existed. Natural selection can support, it can support creation's orchard of life. Okay, where you have the dog kind that has grown in different species, the cat kind that's grown in different species, the whale kind that's grown in different species. It does not support the evolutionary tree of life where there's one common ancestor for all life on the earth. It cannot do that. Let's take a look at this with bacteria real quick. A bacteria can gain resistance. This is a big deal in our society. Well, we got to stop using antibiotics because bacteria are growing resistant to those antibiotics, and that's evolution. And evolutionists will tout that as, see, this is proof. This is evolution. This is happening. However, it's not a new E. coli. It's still E. coli. It's just a antibiotic-resistant strand of E. coli, which has always existed, but now, because you keep getting those antibiotics, it exists in a much more concentrated form. So here's what happens. In order for a bacteria to get resistance to antibiotics, it does this two ways: by losing genetic information and by using a design feature that was built in to swap DNA. A bacteria gains resistance from another bacteria because they can trade DNA back and forth. That's how they get resistance. Antibiotics, here's how they work. They usually bind a certain protein inside the bacteria that prevent it from functioning properly. Okay? And this kills the bacteria. That's how antibiotics work. They interrupt its normal life functions by binding a protein. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria, however, they have a mutation in their DNA which codes for the protein that the antibiotic is binding. The antibiotic, therefore, cannot bind that protein produced from the mutation in the DNA of the bacteria. Thus, these bacteria live, and we call them antibiotic resistant. Okay? However, it comes at a great cost to the bacteria. If the antibiotic resistant bacteria are grown with other bacteria that don't have the mutant strain, the mutant bacteria die in every other living condition. They cannot compete as well to survive because they won't be able to get the necessary nutrients to survive. They do survive, yes, in the environment where antibiotics are being produced, but that's the only environment in which it is better for them to survive in. It's not better for their overall life of the species. It's not better for the overall fruit to carry on the species in any other environment except for the one that is full of antibiotics. The antibiotic-resistant bacteria only survive well in that environment with antibiotics. They become less able to survive in the wild. It is important that we need to keep this in mind, that to gain resistance to antibiotics is not a beneficial mutation, but rather a beneficial outcome of this mutation only in a certain environment. Okay? All right. Speciation has never been observed to form an organism of a different kind, such as a dog species producing a cat species. Speciation only works inside of a kind. Okay? Speciation leads to a loss of information, not the gain of information required by evolution. We've already covered this when the animals left Noah's Ark. There was so much genetic information in the cat kind that the two cats of that kind that left Noah's Ark were able to start reproducing, and over time, through speciation and natural selection, they did develop different species of the same cat kind. But they did not turn into moths, and they did not turn into lizards. Simply put, the changes that we observe today show variation inside a created kind. This is a horizontal change. In order for Darwinian evolution to take place, molecules to man evolution to take place, there must be a change from one kind to another. That is a vertical change. And this simply is not observed, nor has it ever been observed. Natural selection cannot be a mechanism for evolution because it results in a decrease in information. Those beetles that stopped making wings, they lost the ability to make wings. It's gone. They didn't gain the ability to not make wings. No, information was lost, and it only occurs within a kind. Therefore, it is not a mechanism for evolution, but rather, this supports the biblical model. But are there beneficial mutations? There are beneficial mutations, but again, it comes at a cost to the organism and typically only is in certain selected environments. In 1988, a man by the name of Dr. Richard Linsky, he was an evolutionary biologist at Michigan State University. He started culturing, in other words, growing in a lab in a culture plate, all right? He started culturing 12 identical strains or lines of E. coli, right? This is a common bacteria we have in our stomachs, our guts, our digestive tract. Over 50,000 different generations, and 25 years later, okay, the experiment continues. Linsky observed many different things happening in the E. coli as they adapted to being grown in a laboratory environment. Some of the E. coli lost the ability to break down simple sugars. Some of the E. coli lost the ability to repair their DNA because the environment they're being grown in. Some of the E. coli lost the ability to grow a flagellum, which is a hair-like structure that allows it to move and to swim around, so to speak. So in other words, because they're being grown in a cage, in the petri dish, the E. coli are becoming very, very lazy in the lab. If these E. coli that have lost these abilities were grown in a natural setting with the normal wild type of E. coli, none of these mutations would be beneficial and increase their chance for survival and competing for resources. In 2008, Linsky discovered, now this is important because evolutionists say this is proof that evolution took place. Linsky's lab discovered another change in one of the E. coli strands. In the magazine, The New Scientist, an author wrote this: a major innovation has unfurled right in front of our eyes. It is the first time evolution has been caught in the act of making such a rare and new complex trait. But is that really the case? Is that really what happened? Was a rare and complex trait really created? See, normal E. coli have the ability to take citrate. Now, usually they break down sugars like we do. We eat food, carbohydrates, we break down those sugars to get our energy. When oxygen is not abundant in an E. coli's environment, they have the ability to take citrate, a different substance, and break it down in order to gain energies. Okay, but that's when oxygen levels are low. The E. coli, what this author was talking about, this brand new discovery of how evolution is taking place, the E. coli developed the ability to to break down citrate in high oxygen level environments. Okay? All right? This is a beneficial outcome of the mutation that changed under what condition it used citrate. However, it's always been able to use citrate. The mutation caused just an alteration of a pre-existing system, the ability to do citrate. It wasn't new. It just altered when it was now able to use citrate. Instead of only using citrate in low oxygen levels, now this E. coli can use citrate in high oxygen levels. However, the ability to use citrate as an energy source always existed. It's just been tweaked now in the use of when it can happen. In the 1970s, there was another bacteria called Arthrobacter, and it was discovered in ponds with wastewater from a nylon factory. Okay? And it was discovered that this bacteria could digest the byproducts of nylon. Now, nylon was produced, it's a synthetic polymer, right? It's not natural, it's man-made, and it was produced in the 1940s. Thus, the ability of bacteria to break down nylon must have been gained in the last several decades or so. All right? So evolutionists said that the bacteria's ability to break down nylon, a man-made substance, occurred because it gained new genes and because it gained new proteins, since nylon didn't exist in its natural environment. In a 1985 article, listen, entitled "New Proteins Without God's Help," the author explained testing that supposedly showed this bacteria's ability to break down nylon was due to the formation of new proteins, not the modification of pre-existing ones. He stated this: all of this demonstrates that the creationists and others who should know better are dead wrong about the zero probability of new enzyme information. Biologically useful macromolecules, chemicals, are not so information rich that they could not be formed spontaneously from natural processes without God's help. You see, they're so trying to prove that God doesn't exist and all this could happen without a creator, but they can't. They can't because it goes against who God is and the word of truth that we adhere to. In 2007, as our technology has increased, a genetic analysis of Arthrobacter showed that no new genes and no new proteins were added to Arthrobacter that resulted in the ability of the bacteria to break down nylon. Instead, what did they discover? They discovered that mutations in a pre-existing gene resulted in an alter in a pre-existing protein that is capable of breaking down nylon. The protein, known as E2, normally breaks down a substance very similar to nylon, very close to it. And just a slight alteration in what is called the active site of the protein changed its specificity so now that it could break down nylon as well. No changes occurred of the type that was necessary to see chemicals change into man or Darwinian evolution. It just took a tweak. We see the alteration of a pre-existing gene in a protein, not the origin of new proteins or new genes. Information-rich molecules like DNA and protein cannot spontaneously form. They do absolutely need God's help.